Hello and welcome back to episode 14 of The Anecdotalist. I'm your host, Paul Packard, and with me as always, my co-host, Jason McKinney.
How's it going?
So tonight we're going to go within the walls of the Ohio State Reformatory. I don't know what it is about old prisons, but they seem to always kind of be haunted. This one is fun because I'm not sure if you know this, Jason, but it's where the movie Shawshank Redemption was shot.
So I have to admit, I've actually not seen Shawshank Redemption all the way through. I've seen bits and parts of it, but it looks kind of like a violent movie just from the scenes that I've seen.
It's a very great story. The short story by Stephen King is up there too. It's pretty amazing. It's just that it's a classic prison movie. And yeah, it is a little violent because that's what it is. But it's funny because the Ohio State Reformatory is that classic prison look. A lot of times, a lot of the articles and sources I was reading for this episode, there is a lot of talk and conversation about how the reformatory is like the perfect look at what a prison might look like to somebody on the outside. It's known for having a 6-story high cell block, which at the time, and maybe still now, at the time it was the highest stacked cell block. Shawshank Redemption being filmed there, part of that is like it has that classic prison feel. So there is violence in Shawshank Redemption, but that's not the whole story.
Well, I will have to watch it and see the good in it sometime.
Yeah, you should. It's a classic. And then I would also suggest you read the story that it's based on. It's a short story, so it's not super long. It's a novella. Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, I think is what it's called. Which is funny because, of course, they cut out the Rita Hayworth part of the title for the movie. But it's really good. So all that said, keeping with trying to keep our intros short, we're going to jump right in. So, Jason, are you ready?
I am.
Okay, here we go. A dark hallway, cold and uninviting. Whispers of lost souls from former inmates lurk around every corner. Overcrowded and unusual punishment sent men to early deaths. Walking into the hole, a cell designed as punishment for unruly inmates, big enough for only 20 people, but often holding 100 or more. Whispers of "get out" and suffering still linger there. A push or a shove from nowhere is not uncommon. This is the Ohio State Reformatory.
That was creepy. If I hear whispers of "get out" and someone pushes or shoves me and no one's there, I mean, I'm running. I'm not sticking around to say, let's see what else will happen.
Yeah, it's very chilling if you think about like what's gone on here. And that's what makes the Ohio State Reformatory interesting. It's funny. So if you're new to the podcast, most of our ghost stories have been a little bit more definitive. We've had ghosts of Alcatraz. We've had the Moonville Tunnel ghosts. We've talked about a lot of different types of ghosts, and most of those have distinct figures or ghosts that haunt those locations. The Ohio State Reformatory is really interesting because a lot of the sources that I pulled from and I looked at, they talk about the reformatory as this feeling. Everyone that goes there has a feeling of like dread or they shouldn't be there. Each room has its own like feeling or a push or a shove or whispers. There's not like specific ghosts that haunt this place, which makes this episode really unique. And if you listen to our other ghost episodes, you might be coming into this one thinking we're going to have a lot of very specific, there's a ghost in this room, there's a ghost in this room, and there's this specific ghost. What we have is a place that saw a lot of torture, death, suicide, all these crazy things. And now when you go there, again, sources and articles say one of the most haunted prisons on earth, but there's not like specific ghosts that haunt this place. It's like a presence, an evil, a feeling that you get when you're there. So we're going to do our best to talk through that in a podcast.
Which, in my opinion, is kind of scary when you think about it, because it's not stories of like people that lived, but it sounds like we're talking about the manifestation of evil itself in this building.
Yeah, and that's a really good way to put it, a manifestation of evil itself. And it's funny because I think what happens a lot of times with hauntings is that there's two ways to look at it. Someone died a long time ago in a bad way, and their ghost or their soul or whatever it is stuck, and they're back and they're still there. Or a lot of bad things happened at a location, and the location itself has a feeling of dread or sadness or evil or whatever it is. And it's not a specific being, but the location itself has been tainted. And I think the Ohio State Reformatory kind of falls in that latter style of ghost stories. It's more that the reformatory itself has been tainted by all this dramatic sadness, evil, whatever you want to call it. And so you get this manifestation of terrible feelings and pushes and shoves and voices, as opposed to a ghost that died. And like when we talk about, if you remember, Alcatraz Island had a Native American tribe that was there years and years prior. So ghosts that were showing up were these ghosts of Native American spirits, and they would see a Native American in like a circle doing a ritual or whatever it was. Here, you don't really have that. You have a lot of pushes and shoves and smells and things like that and voices that come from just the presence of bad things that happened here a long time ago.
Wow, yeah, this sounds like a Catholic priest needs to make a visit, or a few Catholic priests.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Ohio State Reformatory. It's sometimes referred to as Mansfield Reformatory. It's a prison in Mansfield, Ohio. Probably best known, of course, from the film location of Shawshank Redemption, but also just a lot of ghost activity. So the plan for this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the history of the location first, and then we're going to cover the ghosts and the rooms and the hauntings that lurk here. And then we'll have our own closing thoughts and wrap up the episode that way. So let's go ahead and jump into the history of the Ohio State Reformatory. Okay, so let's start in 1861 with the breakout of the Civil War. So the war kicks off, and Lincoln calls up the militias, which at this point are kind of almost non-existent. They build camps across Ohio to train and prepare men to fight. One of these camps is Camp Mordecai Bartley, located in Mansfield, Ohio, on land owned by a farmer named T. Tingley. This property is the future site of the Ohio State Reformatory. Something like 4,000 soldiers trained there in preparation to fight the South. And it's said that this land was haunted well before the prison ever stood in this location. There were areas on the training grounds that soldiers would refuse to go to because they had like high levels of ammunition failure and other mysterious problems like things going missing. So during the Mary Celeste episode, we talked about superstitions. And at this time, the spiritualist movement was in full swing. A lot of people believed in ghosts and that ghosts could speak and influence the living world. So this escalated amongst the soldiers, and some soldiers reported hearing whispers from dark corners of the training grounds and muffled voices where no one stood. This got so bad for one soldier that he slowly started losing his mind. He became shaky and agitated. He was discharged due to his deteriorating mental state, and eventually he was sent to the Kentucky Insane Asylum, where he died 2 years later.
I mean, when you think about it, just like the thought of having to go to war, I mean, can drive a person insane. I mean, when you think about it, all these soldiers are kind of going through a lot of anxiety, having to prepare for a war that they, didn't know they'd have to fight.
Yeah, it's a very interesting time. I think with a lot of these soldiers, what happens is you have tensions that have risen. They're agitated, they're nervous, they're anxious, and then you all go to this training ground, and there's all these superstitions that are flying. So these people that are already kind of agitated and nervous and anxious about going to war, not just like war against a people that live halfway around the world or fully around the world, but like your own brethren, and in some cases people that you might even have sympathy with. That's a thing you have to wrestle with. And when you put all those people in one location, I imagine there's this feeling of dread or nervousness. And again, like we talked about before, maybe that manifests some being, something in the area. And we don't have a lot of information as to what happened prior here. Like when we talk about, Alcatraz, we talked about the island itself was a place where they would send basically people that were cast out of the tribe that would eventually die of exposure. And here you don't have that, but what you do have is soldiers coming to one location and something is going on there. There is something there that's driving people crazy. I mean, it drove this person to the edge of insanity. And there were locations where they trained where they had high rates of problems with equipment. They had things that went missing. There was like this level of, I guess, a sense of evil, which is kind of funny because when you look back again at Alcatraz, we don't have anybody walking around with mutton chops from this time period. There's no red-eyed demon that was there for years and years and years. It's just that the area itself is like tainted. And even as early as 1861, when these soldiers were there, they were feeling it.
Yeah, so the fact that this evil was talked about and like put into records, and that we're seeing this over 160 years later, that there was this general sense of evil that was like causing these soldiers to go insane. I think that speaks for itself that there's definitely something there.
Yeah, for sure. And that lends to, again, how the reformatory has a feeling of evil, not specific ghosts, but a feeling of dread and misery or whatever it is that lingers here. Apparently it was there before the prison, and apparently it was there before the Civil War camp was there. And so we're going to get more into that here in a minute. I don't want to linger here too much, but yeah, it's a very interesting. I think it really sets the stage for what we're going to talk about here in a moment. So let's talk about the prison itself. The cornerstone was laid in 1886, and the reformatory was opened in 1890. Originally, it was called Mansfield Reformatory with the intention to provide mercy and rehabilitation. Its architect, Levi Schofield, said he was inspired by the style of Gothic church, kind of mixed with an old German castle. And since the initial intent of such a place was reform, the Gothic style was thought to provide like a spiritual uplift. And this was like super unique at the time because at the time it was a matter of we had bad people, we stick them here. But this reformatory was kind of one of the earlier locations where the goal was reform and not punishment.
So it sounds like this place was originally meant for good. Like you said, the Gothic style was thought to provide spiritual uplift. I mean, this place was built off the thought of a church of holiness. I mean, this was supposed to be good.
Yeah, and originally it ran that way. There's a level of, wow, this is like really ahead of its time. But as all good things, eventually they come to an end. And what we run into here is overcrowding and just problems in general, and it devolves pretty quickly. But originally it ran that way. It was eventually completed in 1910. And again, like I said before, it had this tallest stack of cell blocks, which were 6 high. It was also the location of the electric chair that was nicknamed Old Sparky. So it also saw quite a few executions. But reform, again, was its main goal.
So when you say Old Sparky, all I think of is like a dog. When you say Old Sparky, I don't think, oh, someone's going to get electrocuted. I'm thinking, oh, there's a dog.
Yep. It had a friendly name for a very sad, scary thing. And so the first thing I want to really talk about here is the escape attempt that was facilitated by inmate Philip Orlek in 1926. So basically, he came back to the prison while paroled with the intention of staging a breakout. He ended up shooting and killing a 72-year-old guard, who, from everything I read, was beloved by not only the guards, but also the inmates. Orlek ends up getting caught and executed. And this whole thing just is the first of many terrible things that happens here. This guard, I guess, was really close to retirement. I mean, he's 72 years old. He got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this guy, Philip Orlek, comes in, tries to break him out, gets kind of in a wrestling match with the guard, shoots him, and that's that. They were saying that a lot of different guards were saying to him, yeah, it's time. Maybe you hang it up. But he kept on working, and eventually it ended his life. So remember, the intention of this reformatory was rehabilitation and reform, which basically slowly slipped away over time. Part of this was due to a fire at the Ohio Penitentiary that killed something like 300 inmates and displaced another 200. And those 200 ended up here at the Ohio State Reformatory. So now the prison population rises. It's also injected with more violent criminals. And most of the pain and suffering that occurs here is due to overcrowding and just the violence that these new prisoners brought in to the reformatory. I'm not going to get into every death that happened at this prison, as there's quite a few, But there were several escape attempts over the time that led to deaths of prisoners as well as guards. There was a particularly violent murder of a guard by the name of Frank Hanger in 1932 after he was beaten to death during an escape attempt. There were multiple inmates shot to death trying to escape over the years, and one interesting death of an inmate who fell off the roof of a dormitory during an escape. There are stories of suicides and stabbings, which I feel kind of comes up in prisons quite often. You have a fairly congested prison system, and prisoners shanking other prisoners, that's kind of just a story as old as time. There's just a lot here, and my intent is to hone in on some of the bigger stories and lore surrounding this prison, but also to highlight the violence. Before we jump into some of the incidents that I think kind of set the stage for the hauntings, I want to talk about the overall conditions of this place. By the 50s, it had gotten so bad that there are stories of the prison being plagued by rats, disease that spread through like tuberculosis, and most of that was due to tight conditions and just extreme overall violence by mixing of prisoners with reformers. The prison turned towards torture to cure this violence. They used something called the butterfly, which was a form of non-lethal electrocution. They also had a sweatbox and solitary confinement, which we'll talk about here in a moment, that's basically just abused.
It just sounds like violence is the main thing that's happening here. This reformatory that was supposed to be turning these people to good. It doesn't sound like there's a lot of people turn their lives around. It sounds like we stuffed 200 inmates into a building and hoped for the best.
Yeah, that's how it goes. I think what's really interesting is that the original intent was reform, and it was running that way for quite a while. It might sound fast because we're in the middle of a podcast here, an episode. We're kind of running through the timeline, but there was reform for quite a while. But over time, a reformatory becomes basically a penitentiary, and so you can have all the intent in the world, but with the way the world goes and the way things happen, everything's original intent. You spend 40, 30, 40, 50 years and things change. The other thing I was going to say too is that no matter what the intent of a facility is, you're always going to have people, if they're confined against their will, they're going to want to escape no matter what the intent is. And it's a pretty sad thing because you imagine you have a system put together for people to get them back on their feet. And it was way ahead of its time. Think about that. In the 1890s, 1910s, no one was thinking about reforming people that made mistakes or did the wrong thing. The focus was punishment. And so to have a reformatory at this era was groundbreaking. And just the way things go over time, even though that was the original intent, you now have overcrowding, you have violent criminals, and also just guards torturing these people to get them back in line.
Which also, I want to say, I don't think it helps if you discipline with really harsh discipline without trying to figure out what the core issue is. Disciplining just to discipline turns into just them wanting to retaliate.
So it's funny you say that because what I want to talk about next is just that. These guys that come back for revenge. So Robert Daniels and John West, they're out on parole. And once they're out on parole, they go on this murder and crime spree. They end up hatching this plan to go back to the prison and capture and kill a guy by the name of Red Man Harris. And that's a nickname mixed with his name. There was no other written of what his name was, but they call him Red Man Harris. They get there, they're drunk, they end up stumbling into the wrong quarters, the home of Superintendent John Nebel, his wife Nolanda, and his daughter Phyllis. And instead of just retreating, they end up kidnapping all of them. They take them to a field and they execute all three of them. And so that is pretty violent, pretty vicious. One of the guys ends up getting killed during like their capture, and the other one actually does like a TV interview, and you can watch him talk about it, and he has no remorse at all. It's pretty creepy. He talks about what he did, and he's like, I did it. It's time for me to die. Whatever. But that just kind of goes along with they're starting to create these people that want to come back and hold a vengeance and come back and do evil. Whatever it is about this location, something is happening here that is driving this evil intent.
Wow. I mean, that is pretty evil. Like, this family's done nothing to these guys. That is harsh.
Yeah. They wanted to take vengeance on a guard that mistreated them, But they settled. They're like, oh, well, this guy's close enough. He's a superintendent of the reformatory. Might as well kill him and his whole family, which is like crazy to think that they just walk into the wrong quarters, wrong place, wrong time, and they're like, these guys will do. Let's execute them.
Yeah, that is so sad.
So the next thing I want to talk about is the death of Helen Barr Glatt. So the wife of the superintendent, Arthur Glatt. So she was reaching for a shelf in a closet while getting dressed for a night out, and she felt this like hard, cold box, and she moved it aside. It falls off, and inside of it was a loaded gun, and it goes off. It shoots her in the chest. She then gets moved over to a hospital where she dies a few days later. And I read somewhere that there was like some speculation that maybe Glatt had killed her and the whole thing was kind of a setup. But that's really unfounded. There's nothing to actually warrant that. It's kind of more speculation. And he even dies a few years later of a heart attack in his office at the Ohio State Reformatory.
Or it was heartbreak.
People say that. That was one of the things I came across a lot, was that it wasn't really that he had a reason to kill her, and then once she was gone, he just didn't take care of himself and eventually had a heart attack. So another wild and violent story is that of James Lockhart. So Lockhart was in the furniture shop, and he grabs this bottle of turpentine. He goes back to his cell, which is cell 13 on the 4th level of East Block. He takes the turpentine and he pours it all over his head. He grabs some matches, lights it, and just sets himself on fire. And they said the flames burned so hot that the man in cell 14 was like screaming, throwing water in his cell, trying to just cool off the cell next to him, try to keep the flames from coming into his side. And the guards just waited for the flames to burn themselves out because there was really nothing they could do. The guy just lit himself on fire with turpentine and they just kind of waited. And eventually he died by suicide.
Dang, man, no wonder there's like so much evil intent here. There's so much violence.
Yeah, it's just like, and I don't know if it's just because it's a prison in this era or what it is, but there's just a lot of violence here. And you can find a ton of stories of people that killed themselves, killed each other, tried to escape and got shot, whatever it is. There's a lot of violence here. And the last story I really want to dive into here before we get into kind of like the paranormal side of it or the ghosts is that of the solitary confinement incident. So in 1957, there was a riot and something like 120 inmates, they get thrown into solitary confinement. And this solitary confinement is called the hole. It's in the basement. So this hole was nowhere near big enough for 120 people. There's something like 20 cells down there. And each cell was only really big enough for one person, but they crammed 6 prisoners per cell in this basement, and they were down there for 30 days. And so the prison was already kind of overcrowded. The conditions were already deteriorating. They had a rat infestation, and these guys were jammed into an even worse position by being put 6 deep in a cell. So they were sleeping on the concrete floors. They were in complete darkness. And I imagine rats were just kind of roaming. They're everywhere. And it's kind of a horrific way to feel. Like if you think about what that's like, imagine spending 30 days in the dark, crammed in with 5 other guys in a cell meant for one person. And if you could look at pictures online, these cells were tiny. So they were packed in like sardines. Anyways, they made a mistake and they put 2 really violent prisoners into one cell. And so the 30 days are up. They go to get everybody out. And one of the cells only has 5 people in it. And they realize one of the prisoners was murdered and jammed under the bed. That just sounds horrible. I mean, imagine like you're already crammed in there and then one guy kills somebody else and then crams him under the bed and you're sleeping next to a dead body for 30 days. However long it was that he was dead. They don't even know. They just know that he was dead for quite a while. They were gone for 30 days. There's another way this story is told, and I'm not sure how this relates, but there's another story that goes around, kind of the lore of the prison, is that in a separate incident, 2 inmates went into the same cell and only one left. I kind of hang my hat more on the riot side because there's more information about that, historical information. The other is more like a lore of 2 mates going in, 1 mate coming out. But it kind of has that same thing where a prisoner was murdered and jammed under the bed in the hole in complete darkness. So at this point, let's go ahead and shift gears. We talked about the history for quite a while, and let's jump into some of the paranormal stuff. And of course, we talked about, whispers and muffled voices that seem to plague the Civil War camp well before the prison ever existed. And I want to kind of pick up from there. I find it so interesting that there just seems to be an air of despair or evil that just persists in this place. And again, similar to Alcatraz and the long-standing fear of the island, this land seemed to always have some kind of presence, some kind of evil presence just lingering. And so one thing I want to say before we kind of get into specific hauntings or haunted rooms, the reports from inmates while the reformatory was still open, I guess it wasn't super uncommon for prisoners to feel hands tightening the sheets or the blankets around them at night. And there's a story of one inmate who felt like the sheets tightening around him while he was laying in bed. And he sits up and he looks down in his bed, and the blankets to his bed are like neatly tucked under the mattress. So I don't know. It was just kind of a weird thing. Like, we're going to get into like the haunting after the fact, after the prison's closed. But while prisoners were there, I guess it wasn't super uncommon for someone to come and tuck them in at night. Some ghost was coming around tucking everybody in. And it was a super common thing. Just imagine being in prison and you have some friendly ghost coming around and making sure everyone's tucked in at night.
Or that person that was found under the bed, like, just stays under people's beds now, and he just goes under each person's bed and just makes sure that they're nice and tucked in.
Yeah, maybe it could be that. I don't know. But I wanted to say that. I wasn't really sure where to talk about this, but I think it makes sense to talk about it now that we're talking about paranormal stuff. Most of the things I have here are like ghost hunts or whatever, where they uncovered things. The inmates that lived there during the time of the reformatory being live and active, they were getting tucked in at night by a ghost. Okay, so the first location I want to talk about, again, we don't have a lot of like specific ghosts, but we do have a lot of locations that seem to be haunted. And the first one I want to talk about is the chapel. So the chapel is a hot spot of activity, and there's reports of people being grabbed or shoved, as well as shadow figures. This comes up quite a bit, where people will go on into this room and they'll see something walk by in the corner of their eye, and they'll look and there's nothing there. It's a very common thing, I guess, in the chapel to see things or people or entities walking by out of the corner of your eye, and they're not being actual living people standing there. So the interesting thing about the chapel is that it's located supposedly where executions previously took place. And another source claims it was actually the location of where they used to torture people. So we talked about the butterfly electrocution earlier. Supposedly this is where that took place, and the executions took place here before being turned into the chapel. And again, I never really found specific ghosts in this location other than like anecdotal stories about guests who've captured orbs on camera or seen shadow people or been pushed or shoved or whatever else. This location does seem to have a feeling of dread or evil or something, but not like a specific ghost that roams this area.
Well, it kind of makes sense that there would be evil manifesting here. I mean, there's torture, there's death. I mean, obviously this room would be a hot spot. What is this butterfly electrocution that you keep talking about?
I think it's like I saw a picture. I'm not really sure exactly how to explain it. Think about how, and if you ever seen a movie where they do psychotherapy, electrical psychotherapy, where they put like the things on their head, it was kind of like that, where they had these little attachments where they put that over their head in some form, and it wasn't enough to kill them, but it was like a torture method to like put them into submission, essentially.
Jeez, that's sad.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal. Okay, so next we'll talk about the infirmary. The infirmary is also a place that has a ton of activity. There's stories of incredibly poor conditions in the infirmary. So prisoners going days without food, and some actually dying of starvation, and just really poor conditions overall. Rather than being there to be healed, a lot of them went there because they had TB or tuberculosis, and a lot of them didn't leave because of how bad the conditions were. They caught other things or died of starvation. Again, I don't know how accurate this information actually is. It seems kind of anecdotal, like, oh, the infirmary, they would go there and then they wouldn't be fed and they would die. It's kind of like a story, like a legend or a lore or whatever. And there wasn't a ton of sources that specifically talk about those claims. But it seems like the infirmary had a lot of people that went there for disease and they died for some reason, whatever reason it was, whether it was poor conditions. There's a lot of like sense of dread. And people will say when they walk through the infirmary, they'll have like a breeze of cold wind blow through them, or like they'll hit cold spots and they'll just like feel a sense of death in this area. Okay, so let's talk about the basement. So there's a couple things here I want to talk about when it comes to the basement specifically. So of course the hole is down there, but there's also an actual ghost that lingers here. And this is one of the few ghosts that we can actually talk about. And this is the ghost of a 14-year-old boy. So this story kind of mostly comes from psychics that have visited this location and they've gotten reads or they've spoken to a ghost that lived there. And this ghost is of a boy. There's not a whole lot of historical data on a 14-year-old boy dying here, but it's a common ghost that comes up quite a bit. The people that have heard, that have been in this location, have heard from or seen or sensed, or however you want to say it, psychics have talked to this ghost, or they claim to have talked to this ghost, who is that of a boy. And the boy tells them that he was the son of a guard, and while he was down in the basement alone, he was cornered by some inmates and they beat him to death. And now, after being beat to death in this basement, his spirit is stuck there. This is a ghost that comes up very frequently. It's one of the few kind of like hard and fast, there's an actual ghost down here, and it's that of a 14-year-old boy that supposedly was beaten to death in the basement of the Ohio State Reformatory.
Wow, that's like pathetic, man, that these inmates had to go and beat up a 14-year-old kid.
Well, yeah, if you believe that this is, if the psychics are telling the truth and if they actually talked to a 14-year-old boy that was killed here, then yeah, that is kind of a weird thing for the inmates to do. But at the same time, if they're violent inmates and they have an opportunity to act out on a guard and they can put punishment on a guard by killing his son, it kind of makes sense in the context of the guards are mistreating them. They're in bad conditions. They want to stick it to the man or the guards or whatever. So they take it out on one of the guards' sons.
Yeah, that does make sense. And it kind of also just tells you more about how the evil is manifested here, you know? There's no limit to it.
Yeah, exactly. So next is the hole. So we're still in the basement. I want to talk about the hole because this is where we had the incident where the inmates were all in solitary confinement and the one inmate was killed and stuffed under the mattress. And so this is said to be like the most haunted location at the reformatory. And there's a ton of firsthand accounts of nausea and general feelings of malice or ill will. And as we talked about earlier, the hole was used and abused. And so the terrible outcomes, including the murder of the fellow inmate, people often claim to hear mumbled voices, moans, and sounds of what has been described as the voices of someone who's gone insane. One thing I want to pinpoint here, one of the books I read was The Haunted History of the Ohio State Reformatory by Sherri. And I'm going to quote something directly from this book. And this is a quote from Denise Donaldson on one of her many visits to the reformatory. Quote, "We had several issues with the second and third solitary cell. A large black mass at the door not allowing us inside. The feeling was anger, pure hatred." End quote. And in her book, it describes this location, the second or third cell, as the location where the cellmate was killed and stuffed under the mattress. So at this location, there's personal experiences of some dark black mass keeping them from entering the cell.
My question is why would you even try to go into the cell? You see a black mass, that's when you just say, okay, time to go.
Yeah. Yeah. You're like, I'm done here. I'm having a fun little ghost tour. There's a black mass, some kind of shadow figure. I think it's time to leave.
Just like that guard, you know, the guard in the story about he sees this old lady go into the house in old clothes and he just turns around and leaves.
Yeah. The person that was doing the welcoming at the plantation, that episode. Yeah, that was funny. I love that. That he's so smart. He's counter to all ghost stories you hear. He sees a lady dressed in 18th century clothing walk through a closed door, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm done. I'm not working here anymore." That's a great one. Yeah, if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to that episode, the Myrtles Plantation episode. It's about the ghosts that live there. Okay, so next we have another ghost, a specific being that resides in the chair room. So The chair room is really interesting, and it almost feels like a gimmick for like a ghost tour. And I don't know how I feel about it, but there's a lot of firsthand experiences in this room. And it's really weird because it's basically a windowless room, and it has a chair that sits in the middle of the room. And supposedly there's some kind of dark entity that resides in this room. And for whatever reason, it has some affinity for this chair. It has an attachment to this chair. And so there's stories of what people have felt in this room. And it's really interesting because people say, like, if you move the chair eventually will find its way back to the middle of the room. And there's a story of a person that sat in the chair and was mocking the ghost and like out loud saying all these things. And they felt something on their back, like a searing pain on their back, and they got up and their back had all these scratches on it. Again, it kind of feels like a gimmick, like maybe this happened, maybe it didn't. It's like a tour thing. But it's really interesting because if this is true, you have a room with a dark entity that's messing with people, and in this case, actually leaving marks on them, like damaging their skin or attacking them for mocking it, which is really creepy.
So pretty much just don't go into any room in this reformatory.
Yeah.
You're either going to get scratches on your back, or you're just going to get blocked going into the door. Or if you just lay down in one of the rooms, you might get tucked in.
Yeah, you might get tucked in for bedtime. Yeah, it's really interesting. It was funny too is a long time ago I was in Gatlinburg and I went on a ghost tour, and as I was doing the research for this episode and I was coming across so few like actual ghosts, it reminded me of that tour I took through Gatlinburg of like random instances of like violence and dark things. And it has that classic, this is a ghost tour, here's what happened. But it is really interesting because a lot of people have gone here and done like ghost investigations, and they come away with some crazy EVPs and just a lot of recordings of voices. And I don't know, it has a lot of really interesting things. And the chair room is unique in that it doesn't really make sense. There's no rhyme or reason to it, but a lot of people have visited this room and a lot of people have experienced some type of evil entity. And one thing that's common with ghost stories is furniture that seems to move around. And a chair in the middle of a room that gets moved and then finds its way back to the middle of the room is pretty creepy.
My computer chair is like sitting right behind me because I have to like sit in like a regular chair. I'm just waiting for it to start spinning in circles.
Yeah, one of these days we're gonna bring something into our homes, and it's gonna be really bad. That's why we're staying light. We've always said this. If you're new to the podcast or you're recurring, you've heard this, but we try to keep our ghost episodes as light as possible because we're not trying to invite any kind of evil into our homes. So inevitably, something's gonna happen to Jason, and we're all gonna be sad about it.
It's gonna happen to me. Thanks, buddy.
Okay. So the next room I want to talk about is the library. So yet another room that's said to be haunted is the library. And this is a room that often gets shadow figures. So we talked about this earlier, people seeing movement in the corner of their eye. This room gets a lot of that. So I don't know if it's because of the way the room is laid out. I've seen pictures of this room and there's a lot of like really tall windows with lots of natural light. So maybe people are just seeing shadows of like from the light outside. But this is a room where people see a lot of stuff out of the corner of their eye. And again, there's a lot of people that come and do investigations here. And a psychic went into this room and they got a read on a ghost of a nurse who apparently really loved the library and just lingers there. Again, I don't really know the ins and outs of talking to ghosts with psychics, but it seems to be a common thing. This psychic got a read on a nurse, and ever since then, when psychics go here or they find EVPs here, they get information about a nurse that's in this library. For whatever reason, there's a nurse ghost here.
So what you're saying is that the nurse that was supposed to be taking care of the patients in the infirmary was sitting here reading books, and that is now why we have to beware of the infirmary.
Yeah. Okay. So the next thing is the wandering guard. So there's a story of a guard that wanders the prison. And this entity is said to be a guard that was killed on site. There's also the superintendent who had the heart attack in his office. So if this ghost does exist, it's likely one of the former murdered guards, or maybe even the superintendent who died in his office from a heart attack. And it's not really an evil entity. And that would make sense if we're talking specifically about guards that were murdered, but it has an authoritative presence. It kind of reminds me of that ghost at Alcatraz that can be seen kind of walking around with a flashlight on shift. It's that same thing. So if you imagine a ghost that was brutally murdered while working, and the spirit just got stuck in the reformatory, so you have a violent death, and they think they're still working, so they're walking around. There's a lot of like firsthand experiences with this ghost, and a lot of the encounters again are kind of more of a feeling. It's less of, hey, I saw a guard walking with a flashlight, it must have been someone that died as a guard, but more of people feeling the presence of a ghost that had like authority, but not like nefarious authority. They feel like someone's nearby that like kind of runs the show, and there's nobody there, but it's not like an evil presence, which I think is really unique when it comes to ghosts, because they were talking about spirits that are stuck in a location that used to be a reformatory or prison. You're going to have a lot of evil, but you're also going to have ghosts of guards that were murdered there. It just kind of makes sense.
Maybe they're the guards there to keep the evil there.
Yeah, maybe they're on shift keeping the ghost of the prisoners kind of at bay. So another location that's said to be haunted is that of the Glatt residence. And Helen, of course, she dies tragically in this location in her bedroom when the gun fell and shot her. The residence is said to have some random cold spots. And when you're in here, if you bring camera equipment, it malfunctions in this room. So it's a lot of stories of people bringing cameras in and the shutter all of a sudden just no longer working. It's often reported that people hear disembodied voices. Another thing that's often reported here is the smell of flowers. And this oftentimes comes from the bathroom, which is said to be the personal bathroom of Helen Glatt. It's sometimes referred to as the pink room. But either way, either it's Helen's perfume or flowers that were there in a vase, whatever it is. If you're ever at the reformatory and you go into this bathroom, people say you smell flowers very often. And it could be that of Helen getting ready to go out, putting perfume on, and then getting shot and eventually dying. So we've talked about a lot of things, and it feels like we kind of jump from story to story, which is how I expected this episode to go. But there is one more ghost I want to talk about that doesn't really reside in the prison itself, but along the road on the way in. There's a woman, or was a woman, by the name of Phoebe Wise. She was an elderly lady that lived in a house on the road that approaches the reformatory. And from all accounts, she was a hermit and never married. She lived alone and was well known amongst the town as the Hermit of the Heights. She was often seen walking the grounds of her property carrying a rifle. She's kind of doing like a patrol, but she lived alone. She was eccentric. She was unique, and the town knew her as the Hermit. So, it's funny if you look back at lore and legends, it's not unusual for an unmarried woman to get the attention of a town and have legends or stories that kind of get conjured up about you. And that's often how we get legends of witches. And they're just kind of easy targets. And Phoebe was one of those people. So Phoebe dies in March of 1933. But ever since then, she's seen walking the grounds of her property, sometimes carrying a rifle. And she's often seen walking along the road on the way to the prison in a frumpy hat and tattered clothes. She just never left this location.
So she's like the last minute guard guarding these prisoners. If they get past the ghost guards, then they're not going to get past her and her frumpy hat.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like the classic ghost movie trope where they're like driving down the road, everyone's happy and they're heading to like a building, and one person looks out the window and sees some weird thing along the side of the road, and it's a ghost, and everyone else is happy and doesn't see it. And that's what it kind of reminded me of, is like the classic trope of there's a ghost on the road as you drive into the reformatory. But I don't know. Maybe she is the last line of defense for these ghosts to keep them in the prison.
It's so interesting. I mean, it really does make sense that there's like evil manifestation here, especially like the more that people talk about it and build onto the stories. Even to begin with, this area had talk of whispers in the woods. I mean, it was already set up for the manifestation. It just grew from there.
Yeah, and that's what's really unique, I think, about not just this location, but this episode itself, is that we really didn't talk about a whole lot of specific ghosts or people that died and lingered. We talked a lot about like rooms and locations in this reformatory that just had some kind of evil that floats around. And again, at the beginning of the episode, we talked about how I feel like there's two different types of hauntings. There's a location where a very dirty, scary thing happened, a very traumatic thing happened, and that being is stuck. And that's the ghost that haunts the place. And there's the other thing where you have a lot of violence, you have a lot of torture, a lot of evil, and the location itself has this air of violence or evil, and it lingers. We talked about this in another episode. I'm not sure even which one it is, but it could also just be human nature that when a lot of humans die in a location or a lot of humans are tortured in a location, something lingers for us to realize that, hey, we shouldn't be there. That could just be a natural thing where if a lot of people find death in a location, our bodies in some way subconsciously feel that and say, hey, you got to get the heck out of here because you could be next. And maybe that's what happened here at this reformatory. Is there's not a very specific ghost that was here, but so much violence and torture and sadness and evil and misery happened here that now when you go there, your subconscious says, you got to get out of here because bad things happen in this location.
Like an innate feeling or innate evolution feeling. I see what you're saying. What do they call it? I guess it's just like an innate supernatural feeling that you get. Your body naturally learns what to stay away from because it knows it's dangerous. Like animals won't eat certain plants because they might have never eaten that plant before, but they know that there's a danger to it.
It's like a natural selection thing. Kind of how like a dark room, a dark corner scares us because in the past, at some point, we had to hide from dark corners because who knows what was there. Something's there that could kill us. It's that. And somehow it extends to things that happened in the past that somehow now we innately or we subconsciously know that it's bad juju. So, as always, thank you all for tuning into our show. The ghost stories often have a lighter feel to them. I hope you felt that way on this one. They don't take a ton of research. However, this one took a lot of digging just to find some actual hard concrete stuff. So, if you go to our show notes, you're going to see a ton of notes there, a lot more sources than usual. Go ahead and check those out. There's a couple videos there. There's a lot that goes into here. And again, most of it is just kind of what people have felt walking through this prison. So, again, thank you for listening to The Anecdotalist.